Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeo Viking. And here is the part two of There Is No Archaeology Illuminati, a deep look at the false claims of Graham Hancock and an examination of the inner workings of the field of archaeology. Part two. Okay, so where we left off in part one was going over uh, episodes 1 through 5. We left off at we just finished going over episode 5, which was focused on Göbekli Tepe and the Graham Hancock's attempts to connect the carvings at Göbekli Tepe with the modern zodiac, and how one, that doesn't make sense based off of how the zodiac was formed. Two, the carvings at Göbekli Tepe are much more complex than just simply a set of animals possibly representing the zodiac. And three, the archaeological evidence combined with multiple similar carvings. The archaeological evidence at Göbekli Tepe itself and at a nearby proto city of Yaftal, and the similar carvings all suggest that the carving that is the primary focus of Graham Hancock and his colleague Martin Sweatman, to being the possible zodiac, is in fact not the zodiac, but actually a representation of some sort of mythology revolving around a skull cult, which itself is, as I said, heavily attested to in the archaeological record of multiple archaeological sites, not just Göbekli Tepe, but also Yufta Hall. Okay, so now that we've got that out of the way, let's get into part two. So the next episode is episode 6. So the first archaeological site that Hancock focuses on is a site in Louisiana called Poverty Point. Poverty Point is a mound site with multiple mounds, including Mound A, and I'm not sure if that's Mound B or C, as well as multiple ridges that, as you can see, may have very likely been where were living, were basically huts where people lived in were situated. So again, to his credit, as with back in episode 2, Hancock does acknowledge that Poverty Point was in fact built by the indigenous peoples of America. Poverty Point at being being created during what is known as the Archaic period, roughly 8,000 BCE to around 1,000 BCE, which is a period when people were beginning to settle down into much more sedentary sites, much in a similar way to the Natufian peoples that we talked about in episode 6 in the Levant, but they were not performing agriculture yet. But they were building monumental structures such as the mounds like Poverty Point. But again, much in a similar way to to the Temple of Cholula and the Aztec Aqueduct in episode 2, he still tries to connect them in some form or the other, Poverty Point in some form or the other, to Atlantis. So, first of all, the construction of Poverty Point is fairly well known and very much and studied quite a lot, such as in this paper, Poverty Point is a structure event process by Kenneth E. Sassman. Again, as always, pause to read. Pause to read. And so essentially his conclusion of the study is that belaying the vast geographic scale of interactions, Poverty Point denizens appear merely regional in scope because so little of their making mounds included, ventured far from northeast Louisiana. This is true to the synchronic perspective of the heyday when the impressive monument was built and utilized intensively. The longer view exposes a deep and varied history of the acquiring and using non-local chert materials for everyday and perhaps ritual purposes among those of the East Mississippi, and quite distinctly on the west side, those who built the mounds on multiple locations, some potentially integrated at the sub-regional scale. And so the reason I bring this paper up is because Graham Hancock's primary hypothesis for the building of Poverty Point is essentially that Poverty Point is aligned somehow to the solstice, to the various solstices and equinox. Now, in and itself, this claim is not that bad, because we do know many monumental sites throughout the world were connected to the equinoxes and such. However, there are two issues with this. The first issue, and most immediate issue, is that there is no evidence that Poverty Point was built in this way. And again, you can read this further on, but essentially, like this paper by Sassman, if we go on to read, is that Poverty Point, the broad brushstrokes of this history provide the the inductive basis for postulating how Poverty Point architects incorporated ancient mounds and monument making logic in their own constructions, and how symbolic transposition of Poverty Point earthworks embraced communities of increasing greater social distance at a proportionally increasing spatial distance. I further propose that the ritual institutions for integrating diversity were reproduced through the regular acquisition of non-local cherts, and with the contacts with foreigners such as acquisitions most likely entail. Finally, I suggest that Poverty Point was ultimately an ethnogenetic consequence of established interregional alliances whose role in making persons continue to be relevant as a collective model of cultural diversity. And then he goes on to explain that more. So essentially, Poverty Point, based off of his evidence, was built not to, say, align with the equinoxes, but it was built as a way to essentially, it was built as a byproduct of regional alliances for either like getting non-local church or anything like that. And so it was a communal effort from multiple different regional groups creating this monumental structure as an ethnogenetic byproduct. And then, this goes on more. And you can feel free to pause and read this last little portion, and of course the acknowledgments. A similar hypothesis is also brought up in this article known as Building Mound A at Poverty Point, Louisiana Monumental Public Architecture, Ritual Practice, and Implications for Hunter-Gatherer Complexity. And I'll go ahead and read this abstract. Hunter-gatherer societies are often characterized by limited complexity and social equality, something that Graham Hancock brings up multiple times in his books and in this documentary series. Therefore, the construction of monumental architecture by hunter-gatherers is seen as the manifestation of social and political inequality. The massive size and rapid construction of Mound A at Poverty Point, roughly around 3,261 years ago, or 1261 BCE, in Northeast Atlanta, challenges these notions. Geoarchaeological investigations of stratigraphy at the macro and micro levels shows there are no erosion events, natural episodes of soil formation, or cultural stages. We infer from these results that Mound A was constructed by a large labor force over a short period of time. There is no evidence, however, that the mound was constructed under the aegis of a ranked social political system. We argue instead that the mound was constructed as a ritual feature, and that leadership required to mobilize labor and resources was situational and emerged through ritual practice that developed because of the need to integrate a large population. And again, you hear her methods Feel free to pause and read. In fact, I recommend it as always. Feel free to pause and read. But essentially, her conclusions are monumental architecture has long been used as a measure of social and political complexity, and is often assumed to be an index of political authority based on the assumption that the large-scale public building projects require formal leadership to plan construction, to provide resources, and to mobilize and motivate labor. The very presence of public monumental architecture has served as a prime indicator that institutionalized leadership had developed in the region. Therefore, hunter-gatherers who design and construct public monumental architecture are considered to have a ranked social structure on the assumption that such displays must reflect the existence of leaders with strong socially sanctioned authority. Recent approaches to understand social, economic, and political practices have revised these notions about authoritarian or top-down leadership structure being the sole mechanism that supports the emergence of perpetual social complexity, much like she describes in this paper. And you can, again, pause to read. And so essentially so I'm going to read this little part right here. The absence of any indication of material and social inequality at Poverty Point suggests that the ritual practices may have provided these social sanctions that enabled a limited number of people to direct and lead construction of monumental architecture. Ritual practices could have additionally provided the collective motivation for the corporate group to participate freely in the labor effort without requiring institutionalized public coercion. Ritual sanctions and regulations are, in and of themselves, a form of authority, but in these instances, political decision-making and directional authority is vested through the corporate group rather than the individual. We find no evidence that institutional authority and ranking are the avenues that led to the historical outcomes seen at Poverty Point. And then she see here. Seen at Poverty Point, and that that it was not the sole prerogative of centralized political authority. The enormity of the Poverty Point site and its earthen constructions reflects a society deeply attached to it and invested in the transformation of its landscape. Although monuments are often viewed collectively as static elements, of a landscape, their individual construction histories and evolving life forms are important indicators of the social lives of their builders. Poverty Point has always been a unique place. I'm skipping down a little, and our data do nothing to refute this notion. The construction of Mound A requires that we seriously rethink how we conceptualize the late archaic socio-political and socio-economic complexity. It forces anthropologists to reassess how we think about hunter-gatherers and their organization. Whatever the structure of Poverty Point society, it is unlike anything documented in the historic or contemporary hunter-gatherer ethnographic record. Poverty Point and the remarkable mound building and earth moving at the site are unique at a global scale, and our research is a starting point for placing the site in its historical context. So again, much like with Sassman, this paper talks about how Poverty Point was not built for some astronomical purpose involving the solstice, but rather it was built as a part of a group corporate effort involving multiple immigrant groups or multiple far-flung groups who would come here for resource collection or would come here for trade or what have you. Which I think is just as fascinating and important to research about as astronomical knowledge, or whether or not a culture had astronomical knowledge. Okay, so the next site that we come to, that episode 6 focuses on, is a site in Ohio called Serpent's Mound, which you can see here, the reason it's called that. And again, Hancock tries to connect this site to Atlantis. In fact, I should stop saying again because we know that this is going to be every episode. But anyways, he tries to connect this site to Atlantis. And again, to his credit, he does say that this site has two proposed dates for building. I believe like 327 BCE. Well, we'll see in a second for sure, and around 1100 CE or BC and 80. And he also, yet again, makes the claim that this is connected to the solstice and other astronomical events. And in fact, he claims that the coils of the serpent are connected to the various equinoxes and solstices. And then, yet again, makes the claim that archaeologists do not care and do not want to do research about the solstice and that they overlook it, much in the way that he did with Poverty Point. So, and so, first of all, also he goes into he also makes the claim that, in fact, while archaeologists think we know, or at least we have a pretty good idea, but while archaeologists think that that Serpent's Mound was built first around 327, or around the 300s BCE, that essentially there was actually another earlier mound that the culture from the early woodland, the roughly 1,000 to 500 BCE, actually, rather than being the Edina, the early woodland culture that is most archaeologists are pretty sure, well, that many archaeologists are pretty sure built the first iteration of this mound. He thinks that there's an earlier one under it built by this lost Ice Age civilization, Atlantis. So first of all, let's take a look at what the archaeologists say. Well, one group, such as in this paper titled Serpent Mound Still Built by the Edina and Still Rebuilt During the Fort Ancient Period, titled authored by William Monahan and Edward Herman, that essentially the Serpent Mound was first built, yeah, that was right, was first built around 320 BCE in the early to middle woodland period transition, and then was rebuilt again around 1100 CE by the Fort Ancient culture, which was a Mississippian culture. However, it's still heavily debated because this paper titled Mississippian Iconography of Serpent Mound, authored by Bradley Lepper, argues the opposite. He argues that essentially Serpent's Mound is a solely Mississippian creation, and it's in the shape of the mound and the shape of a serpent with a what's possibly an egg coming out of it is actually a representation of the Degiasuan traditions of the first woman birthing the cosmos. Which I want to go ahead and say here that the idea of a mound depicting in a certain direction a serpent or a figure birthing the cosmos is already a nail on the head to Graham Hancock's second claim that archaeologists do not pay attention to when mounds are possibly oriented to celestial events. Lepper goes on to point out that there are very similar petroglyphs, rock carvings showing a similar serpent image or a similar image of a woman and a figure known as the Great Serpent birthing the cosmos. And so with that, as well as with other archaeological evidence such as pikes and other ceramics showing similar depictions, Lepper has come to the conclusion that this was solely a mound built by the Fort Ancient people, not the Adena, because the Adena have no iconography like that we know of, but the Mississippian cultures, such as the Fort Ancient people, did. Yeah. Now we're going to go on to another thing. So first of all, before we go on to that, I do want to say, this already right here, this debate right here already is in itself a nail on the head to Hancock's claim that archaeologists won't entertain new ideas, like the field of archaeology will ostracize people, because this debate has actually been going on, because there was an earlier paper that I could have used. This paper was written by Bradley Lepper, was written in 2020, but there are earlier papers. He had a paper response. This was actually a response. William Monahan and Edward Herman actually wrote this paper in response to a 2018 paper written by Bradley Lepper. Then Bradley Lepper wrote a paper in response to this in 2019, and they wrote a response in 2019 as well. And Bradley Lepper wrote this in 2020. For a career field, for a group to want to squash new ideas, they seem to allow people to publish conflicting papers with conflicting views quite often. I mean, again, 2018 and 2020 are not that far apart, let alone the fact that he had a similar paper, Lepper had a similar paper published in 2019. And I will go over that, this idea more in part 3, but I just didn't want to go ahead and bring this idea forward, that like you're already seeing how people can disagree and still be archaeologists. People can have different ideas from other archaeologists and still have perfectly fine careers as archaeologists. They do not get kicked out of the field of archaeology, which is, of course, what Graham Hancock likes to claim, is that the archaeology Illuminati, as I coined in the title, will somehow come and prevent people from changing the status quo. So, yeah. Okay, so now another thing I want to put the final nail in the head in, is, as I already did with Bradley Lepper's paper, is the idea that that archaeologists do not pay attention to or entertain or bring up the possible connections of these mound sites or other megalithic sites with celestial events like the summer solstice and spring equinox and such. And I've already done that with Bradley Lepper's paper, where it talked about the possible connection of surface mound with the celestial event of the creation of the universe. And I will continue that with this book right here that I actually have right here, if you can see it. Early middle woodland landscapes of the Southeast. And the first pages I will use are from chapter 8, from a paper titled Biltmore Mound and the Appalachian Summit Hopewell by Larry Kimball and Thomas White and Gary Kritz. And if any of them are watching this, if I mispronounced your names, feel free to correct me and I'll apologize. The first page I will look at is 124. And so this is from the top of 124, and the paragraph is follows. The order of our discussion follows the evident and arguably ritual steps undertaken by the mound creators: mound construction, the erection of structures and ritual posts, the creation of a ritual space around the mound by a ditch, which was backfilled in a specific manner. What kinds of foods were consumed on the mound, and finally, how variously colored mound stages, the ditch and mound structure, and the central ritual post together are not only symbolize the axis mundi or three world system, but they were also used to observe the summer solstice sunrise over Mount Mitchell. Okay, so that's one mention of the summer solstice in just this one paper alone. So let's go to the next page, 129, same paper. In the case of Biltmore Mound, this is another paragraph. This is a paragraph towards the bottom of page 129. In the case of Biltmore Mound, the large central post was positioned on a line connecting Mount Mitchell, the highest peak east of the Rockies, with Mount Pisgah, the second highest peak of the Asheville Basin Rim. Preliminary study by Larry Kimball and Derek Johnson of the alignment of the southwestern corner of the mound structure from the ditch through the ritual post, post 21, strongly suggests the orientation of the sunrise of the summer solstice in AD 590 directly over Mount Mitchell, or 590 CE. Okay, so that's two mentions of a mound being connected to the summer solstice in this paper alone. So the next page is 136. And here we go to the conclusion. And so how the conclusion goes is essentially, let's see here today. It makes more sense to envision a variety of reasons that Hopewell peoples would travel afar and leave exotic items at Constantine mounds. The Biltmore Mound evidence indicates that there was probably broad-scale participation by powerful religious practitioners of various kinds, leaders and possibly family groups outside of the Southern Appalachians, who came to this place to participate in the following. 1. Scheduled communal feasts. 2. Construction of multi-layered earthen platforms and peripheral ditches. 3. Construction of very large mound structures, whose wall was centered on the ditch. So construction of a very large mound structure, singular, not plural, sorry. The placement of a large post having ritual rather than structural function. And the possible observation of the summer solstice over Mount Mitchell in alignment with the central ritual post, probably other astronomical observations as well. So just in this one paper alone, there were 3 mentions of this mound, Biltmore Mound, being connected to the summer solstice. And in fact, as I just said, with the last mention is that it was probably connected to multiple others astronomical events as well. So the next paper, so with that, as I said, with that paper alone, there were already 3 mentions alone of a mound connected to the summer solstice and other astronomical events. But the next paper we're going to look at is the Woodland Period Cultural Landscape of the Leak Complex by Scott Keith. We're going to look at pages 146 through 148. So it says right here, the most obvious post alignment in the Swift Creek Midden, and actually, let me rephrase that, 146 through 147. That was a mistime. Anyways, the most obvious post alignment in the Swift Creek Midden is a single line linear arrangement of posts spanning a distance of 45 meters. The posts are similar in size and soil fill and are spaced at regular intervals of 1.7 meters. If the azimuth of this post row was extended to the northeast, it would bisect Mound B. Coincidentally or not, this angle, set at 63 degrees by 243 degrees, is very close to those of the summer solstice sunrise, being at 61 degrees, and the winter solstice sunset, being at 241 degrees. Sutherland in 2002 interpreted this row of posts as a possible palisade. However, the line of posts runs through the heart of the site, and palisade walls are not typically found at middle woodland mound centers. Rather than representing the remains of a palisade wall, this post row may represent the evidence of a solar observatory associated with Mound B, which historically was conical. Rigorous astronomical analysis will be needed to test this hypothesis. So there you go. There's in the paper titled Biltmore Mound in the Appalachian Summit, Hopewell, you have 3 clear mentions of the Biltmore Mound being connected to the summer solstice and other astronomical events. And in this paper by Scott Keith, The Woodland Period Cultural Landscape of the Leak Complex, we have a very clear mention and hypothesis about leak formed, where it is supposed and postulated that perhaps the link mounds were connected to some sort of solar observatory. So we have not one, not two, but three different archaeological academic papers talking about some sort of a mound or mounds being connected to celestial events, something that Graham Hancock claims archaeologists won't even won't even consider. So that's a nail on the head of that hypothesis, or that part of his hypothesis. Another interesting thing, the thing that baffles me the most about Graham Hancock's focus in this episode is that, you know, he's focusing on Poverty Point and Serpent Mound as possibly being connected to this Ice Age, lost Ice Age civilization, but he doesn't focus on this. So this is an abstract of a paper talking about how recently, like very recently, in June of this year, in fact, mounds on the LSU campus are hypothesized to be about 11,000 years old, using radiocarbon dates and a variety of other dating methods. But of course, you know, to be fair, the author of this paper also acknowledges that much more dating needs to be done. But the point is, these are still mounds that were possibly built around the same time as Göbekli Tepe. And instead of focusing on this and like going in and going, I must, you know, look at, you know, we have a mound site that is built around the same time and could be built by this Atlantis people, he goes and focuses on much younger mound sites. So, I mean, I guess that's good-ish because now he's leaving this alone, but it's also like baffling why he wouldn't even consider it. So there you have it. No, these mounds were not connected to Atlantis. No, Poverty Point was not connected to celestial events. It was probably constructed as a corporate effort by multiple immigrant communities. And archaeologists do, in fact, consider and look at and even hypothesize and write about mound sites being connected or to astronomical events if there is evidence of it. Okay, now we are going to move on to episode 7. So the focus of episode 7 is a site called in the Cappadocia region of Turkey called Derin Kuyu. So Derin Kuyu is an underground city complex that has been carved into this very soft rock material called tuft, making it, because it's very soft, it makes it very easy, or at least made it very easy for whoever carved it originally to begin carving out an underground city in this region. See here, yeah. So Graham Hancock, as he's done with all these other episodes, pretty much immediately starts to go about trying to connect this site to Atlantis. So all right. So what he does is he at least goes and consults the archaeologists who work on the site, and he listens to who they think possibly built the site, and then decides, and he even tells them in the episode as he's talking to them that no, I don't think that those were the people who built it. They may have lived here, but I don't think they built it. And then starts going about saying that it was carved out by Atlantis. And his whole thing is because there has been no, and this time he is actually right, there has been no carbon dating done with these sites. All of the dates of Derin Kuyu that have been gleaned about its possible origin go back to the idea that it was Essentially, they were relative dates. They were based off of the artifacts, not off of, like, say, uranium 12 or carbon 14 dating. So you might be asking, well, since Graham Hancock is um, ignoring what people are saying, what archaeologists are saying about who built this, you know, like in claiming Atlantis, who built it? Like, who was these two most likely uh, scenarios, the two most likely cultures that archaeologists think built the site based off of the relative dates the artifacts provided? Well, the first is the Hittite Empire. And it was a powerful empire that was established roughly around the 1600s, 1500s CE, BCE, until around the 1100s BCE. And it rivaled the powerful Assyrian and Babylonian empires, the Mitanni Empire, and the Egyptian empires. And so, knowing this, you might be asking, well, why did the Hittite Empire build it if it is them? Well, first, we need to consider, like, what was the purpose for doing Kuyu? Was it really for defense, or was it for some other reason? And so we go to this paper, the study of Derinkuyu underground city in Cappadocia, located in pyroclastic rock materials, where they actually take a look at that. And you can pause to read, but basically they say that essentially they built cities, like these underground cities are built because they are so defensible. Like see here, the basic building condition of building underground cities was conditions of safety. It obviously varies with military technologies and capabilities of various civilizations in the historical period. It means that in the past, people were hiding from raids, horses, and infantry armies. Currently, underground safety protection is aimed against nuclear and other bombing attacks. Only subsequently is it aimed against attacks of two opposing parties. The primary advantage is obtained at the beginning. People can hide before the enemy while they are not easily accessible to them. Safety underground cities are not fully secured. During the unveiling of potential enemies, during the unveiling of potential enemies easily accessible to them. Safety, yeah, yeah, potential enemy, yeah. So also occur certain risks that the other buildings do not have to deal with. This includes the possibility of flooding of the underground space, gas attack, etc., etc. So there you have it. And this goes on to talk about how easily, like dust production, and reducing environmental burden on cities, etc. All kinds of reasons to build these sort of fortifications, including these modern reasons right here. So, with all of that in mind, the question is still at, well, now we know that these types of cities are built as a form of protection, as a form of defensive structure of some kind. Why would the Hittites have done this? Well, and okay, and pause here is more of the same that I just talked about. Well, towards the end of the Bronze Age, was an event known as the Bronze Age collapse, where essentially a variety of factors began to cause the collapse of most of these Bronze Age civilizations, such as rebellions, crop failures, famines, disease outbreaks, droughts, etc., etc. Raids from semi-nomadic tribes. You basically anything that could go wrong during this point in time did go wrong. Earthquakes happened in higher frequencies. In Egypt, you had losses of territory and inflation, grain shortage, etc. And of course, during this point in time, you saw a lot of large scale migration. You saw the Mysians and the uh, Eretrians begin to move into with the territory of the Middle Assyrian Empire. You begin to see the Arameans, the Chaldeans, and the Chaldeans begin to move into the Kassite Babylonian Empire. The Berber tribes of Libya begin to launch raids on Egypt. The ancestors of the Jewish people, the Hebrews, begin to move into the area of Canaan, which had once been a province of Egypt, but Egypt had now lost it. In Greece, you begin to see the Illyrians and the Dorians begin to come into the area. Raids by various coalitions of sea peoples who included the Philistines, but also may have included the Minoans and the Mycenaeans begin to raid various coastal cities. And of course, the Thracians, the Phrygians, who we'll talk about in a minute, the Kaskas, and the Dardanians begin to move into Anatolia. And basically, all of these movements and these raids combined with the famine, with the drought, with the earthquakes, with the rebellions, with the outbreaks of disease, basically begin to take a toll on all of these Bronze Age empires until the only two who are left standing are the Assyrian Empire in a much diminished form and the Egyptian Empire in a much diminished form. The rest completely collapse. And this is actually a very well documented event, which very well documented event written about by multiple archaeologists, including Eric Cline, who wrote about it in his very good book that I highly recommend, 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. And then another the other archaeologists, Anna Kilbrew and Gunnar Lehmann, in their book, The Philistines and Other Sea Peoples in Text and Archaeology. And and actually, and again, this is sort of like much like the ignoring the complete overlooking of the 10,000, 11,000-year-old mounds on the LSU campus. It just sort of baffles me that that Graham Hancock would overlook this, because again, his whole thing is that a civilization collapsed around the Younger Dryas period, and therefore led to the development of new civilizations. But but the building of Derinkuyu doesn't require that. For one thing, it's well after the end of the the last glacial maximum, or what he calls the Ice Age, like by tens of thousands of years. Another thing, there's already an incredibly interesting, and I would argue a much more interesting event in a very similar light that happened in that area that archaeologists do have the evidence for, which is the Bronze Age collapse. It's also important to note that while the cultures in the Mediterranean and the Near East, the Levant, collapsed during the Bronze Age collapse, other cultures that they traded with, the Bronze Age societies of Scandinavia and the Bronze Age societies of the Atlantic coast of Europe, and then the Bronze Age societies of continental Europe, all persisted. While the Bronze Age collapse did affect them a little, they were, much like Egypt, were able to survive, and much like Assyria, were able to survive, and actually survived it much better than those, and they were able to continue on much farther in to the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, only beginning to collapse around the 700s to the 500s BCE. And I will also provide a source for these as well. So now it comes to, like, who was the second possible culture who built Derinkuyu? And actually the culture that is viewed by archaeologists the most likely culture to do this. Well, that culture is the Phrygians, one of those groups that began to move in to Anatolia. during the move into the Hittite Empire area during the Bronze Age collapse. In fact, it's postulated that the Hittite Empire built Derinkuyu, if they did build it, in part to defend against the Phrygians. So there's that, but it's also thought highly possible, in fact, more likely, that the Phrygians were, in fact, the first people to do it. At least by some. Some think it was the Hittites, but either way, they all acknowledge that the Phrygians definitely had a part in expanding it. And how do we know this? Well, again, archaeology, like in this book where it talks about actually both of those. It is thought that the Hittites may have excavated the first few levels in the rock when they came under attack from the Phrygians around 1200 BC. However, some archaeologists believe the oldest caves, those hewn with stone rather than metal tools, are substantially older, which is something I didn't even think about until right now. Graham Hancock talks about how archaeologists don't acknowledge that the caves could possibly be older, but you have right here they're talking about that the caves are possibly older. So yeah, but anyways, and then talks about that the Phrygians took it over later, etc., etc. And then here we have another one where it says the exact same thing. It's like one of the characteristics, the paper written by Daniela Ionella Schilla and Emila Cornella Dunca. Actually, let me go back and say this. This is a book called Regional Architecture in the Mediterranean Area, edited by Alessandro Bucci and Luigi Molo. Anyways, but this paper actually talks about the origins of Derinkuyu a little bit, and right here we go. One of the characteristics of the underground cities, Cappadocia, is set. It is known that in this region there are over 100 underground settlements, many of which are open to the general public. However, Derinkuyu underground city is located in the eponymous town at a distance of 40 kilometers of Goremi, Turkey. Originally built in soft volcanic rock in Cappadocia by the Phrygians in the 8th and 7th century BCE, the underground city Derinkuyu was expanded in the Byzantine period. So, as you can see, there's two sources already talking about both the Hittites and the Phrygians being the builders of the site, and despite Graham Hancock's claims that archaeologists refuse to acknowledge the possibility that people carved it before them, we have seen that people are actually talking about it and saying that, yeah, we think it was probably carved before the Hittites. So there's that. And as to the question, this is so the next question is, well, why did the Phrygians either carve out Derinkuyu or use and expand Derinkuyu? Well, again, for defense and for a very similar purpose. And this time, it was a defense against the very powerful and expansionist Neo-Assyrian Empire. Essentially, after a 200-year hiatus in which they were in decline, the Assyrians not only recovered, but they came back stronger than ever, and they began expanding until they encompassed all of this area in brown here. And of course, one of the first areas they went to was around the Cappadocia region. And the Assyrians were known for brutally torturing and defeating anybody who would not surrender to them or submit to them. And they would do things like cut off their ears or take iron rings and attach them to people's ears and essentially drag them like cattle. So, of course, the Phrygians would not want to fall this fate, and therefore they would use the area of Derinkuyu, the city of Derinkuyu, for defense. Now, Hancock likes to say, well, there was nothing strategic about the area that Derinkuyu was in. It's like, well, I mean, as you can see, the Assyrians did come to this area, so whether or not you see something strategic about it, they clearly did. This was their this was very much their apex. Okay, so now we are going to the final episode, episode 8. So We're going to do episode 8 in 2 parts. The first part will be in this this right here, part 2 of the series, and then the next part will be in part 3, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Okay, so the first thing that is focused on in episode 8 is a region in eastern Washington, a geographic feature known as the Scablands. That you can see here, it sort of looks like a scab. And yeah, that's what we'll do that. So and the person that he brings in to analyze this region is first he brings so let me explain a little bit why he comes here. So as I said, he believes Derinkuyu was built by an ancient Atlantis culture, and unfortunately, as I was talking about it, I forgot to mention why he thinks this Atlantis culture built Derinkuyu. So he believes Derinkuyu was built as a sort of a disaster shelter to hide from the Younger Dryas event, and which he thinks included things like large-scale flooding and fires and things like that. So that's why he's coming here, because he believes that this Scablands area is evidence of his large biblical-style floods. And the person he brings in to talk about this is this individual on the left, Randall Carlson. So Randall Carlson already is a very problematic figure. You see, Randall Carlson used to call himself a geologist. However, he, in recent years, was outed for at least not having a master's and a doctorate. I don't know if he has a bachelor's, but I know he definitely does have his master's and doctorate, because people called the schools that he was claiming he got his graduate degrees from, and they had no record of him ever going there. And to Hancock's credit, he does call Randall Carlson an amateur geologist in the episode. But again, while he's calling him that and he's not lying about it, that's still problematic because he's not getting an actual geologist to come analyze this. So, according to Randall Carlson, the Scablands were formed in a singular event. So the theory goes, the mainstream theory by most geologists is that multiple large-scale floods over the course of millions, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years during the last glacial maximum occurred, in which during the glacial maximums, large dams would happen where essentially large ice walls would form and dam in water, and they would form large Great Lakes such as Lake Columbia and Lake Missoula, both of which were larger than multiple of the U.S.'s modern day Great Lakes. And then eventually these walls would break, these ice dams would break, release the water, and they would come out all like this and flood the area. And then after several of these events of these large amounts of water coming through, it would carve out these Scablands in much a similar way that the Grand Canyon and other canyons were formed. Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock disagree with this assessment, and they believe that it was one singular flood, and in the words of Randall Carlson, and I am not making this up, he says this word for word, and I quote, "This would have been a immense amount of water that was filled with giant building-sized icebergs, and the flood waters would have contained more water than all of the lakes and rivers in the world combined." Which, like, how do you come to that conclusion? Like, I mean, if you that essentially just sounds like the Pacific Ocean flooded the area. And to be fair, we do know like the Midwest and other regions like South Georgia, South Florida, Alabama, and Louisiana and such were millions of years ago under the ocean. but he's not making that claim. He's making the claim that this was a freshwater event where more water than all of the rivers and lakes combined in the world carved out of this, which is a Herculean amount of water, and that would fill up way more than all of this. It also doesn't fit with the data. So first we come to this master's thesis by Erica Medley, and you're free to pause and read. And here are her methods. Feel free to pause and read more of her methods. Oh, okay, my bad. Okay, oh, I guess I'm okay. So yeah, so is essentially what she says is ancient cataclysmic floods were the Ice Age floods that left erosional and depositional features preceded the Missoula floods, which happened roughly between 18,000 and 15,000 years ago in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. All previously studied ancient sites were visited, and new sites, 14 of which were the old sites, and new sites, 11 were found. 4 Missoula flood quarries were also visited. A total of 29 sites were studied in the thesis. Essentially, let me find. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, ancient cataclysmic flooding initiated in the early Pleistocene, at least 1.5 million years. 16 field sites show evidence for early Pleistocene flooding preserved in all 6 provinces. And it just goes on to describe those. So yeah, so essentially we see the flooding started all the way back 1.5 million years ago, and it happened multiple times, with the last flooding event being happening with Lake Missoula actually flooding 4 times in between 18,000 and 15,000 years ago, long before the Younger Dryas, and we'll get to that in a minute. And actually the flooding started 1.5 million years ago. So that's one thing that hits the nail, it puts another nail in this, the coffin of the hypothesis of Graham Hancock and his colleagues. And again, here are her methods. Feel free to pause and read, and then we come to this next. Go back and let you pause and read that. Oh yeah, there we go. Yeah. And so yeah, the Pleistocene is broken up into 3 age ranges: early Pleistocene, 2.5 million to 780,000 years ago; middle Pleistocene, 780 to 126,000 years ago; 126 to 11,000 years ago. All pre-Missoula floods deposits were termed middle Pleistocene, and this thesis to differentiate from the late Pleistocene Missoula floods. Early to middle Pleistocene deposits range from stage 2 to stage 3 soil development. Late Pleistocene Missoula flood deposits contained only stage 1. So yeah, there you go. So yeah, stage 1, yeah, etc., etc. So yeah, so again, the Missoula floods started 1.5 million years ago. All right, now we move on to this paper. This paper titled 10 BE Dating of the Pleistocene Megafloods and Cordilleran Ice Sheet Retreat in the Northwestern United States, authored by Andrea, Balbas et al. Again, feel free to pause and read, but essentially it says one of the largest floods occurred around 18,000 to 1.5 million years ago, flowing down the northwestern Columbia River, etc., etc. The upper Grand Coulee fully opened as a flood route after 15,000 to 1.3 million years ago, becoming the primary path for late Missoula floods until the last ones from the glacial Lake Missoula between 1.2 million to 14.7 thousand years ago. So there's that. The last of the large scale floods that happened that carved out the scablands happened 2,000 years before the Younger Dryas. So the Younger Dryas event, we'll talk about that a little more in a minute, was from 12,900 years ago until around 12,000 years ago. So this is 2,000 years before the Younger Dryas even began. And again, here's, pause and read. Here are the results. And it says, you pause and read. And it says, in summary, our new chronological information suggests the following. Blockage from the Clark River by Purcell Trench Lobe by circa 18,000 years ago, resulting in the Missoula floods following the Columbia River Valley. Blockage of the Columbia River Valley by the Okanagan Lobe before 15,000 to 11. Okay, sorry, I said 1.4 million. Sorry, that's 1.4 thousand years ago or 11,000 years ago. Anyways, which shunted Missoula floodwaters across the Channel Scablands. The final Missoula floods between 14,000 years ago to 11.2 thousand years ago. But you get plus or minus 1.4 thousand years. So I need to make a massive correction already in this video. I've been reading this wrong, and I'm dumb for reading this. So yeah, so 14,000 years ago, plus or minus 1,000 years, was the last glacial flood. So yeah, so again, still about 2,000 years before the Younger Dryas. Anyways, plus or minus 1.2 thousand years, signaling the retreat of the final Missoula floods happened during that time, signaling the retreat of the Purcell Trench Lobe from the Clark Fork Valley. Yet these floods entered a glacial Lake Columbia, still impounded by the Okanagan Lobe. Down Columbia floods at circa 14,000 years ago from breakouts of the glacial Lake Columbia, signaling the retreat and final damage of the Columbia Valley by the Okanagan Lobe. So again, the last of the floods happened 2,000 years before the Younger Dryas even began. Okay. Yeah, and so this is the end of this video. We will pick up episode 8, part 2 of episode 8, in part 3 of this video series. If you have any questions about any of the things I went over in this video, feel free to leave a comment. And remember to like, share, and subscribe.